The 1970s were a kind of tense time in the United States. While not as much in pandemonium as the 1960s, this decade was still home to social, political, and economic change. Women, African Americans, gays, lesbians, and other trivialized people continued their fight for equality. They strived for equal protection under the law and economic rights. People became more focused on themselves and centered their life upon self improvement. This change was the product of the hopeless ideals of people in the 1970s. People of this decade welcomed carefree attitudes which were reflected in trends like drugs, disco culture, and open sexuality. Why were people so carefree? Why did people get into things like drugs? They did this as an escape from a depression that swept over the nation. In 1968, Nixon was elected by the Great Silent Majority. President Nixon used the term silent majority to describe a group of white Americans who were anxious and disappointed by the perceived radicalism of the late 1960s. This silent majority supported his policies, and Nixon left everyone else to only amount to a noisy minority. Following the turbulent and sad 1960s, Nixon made promises to make things better. He assured the public that he would move us out of Vietnam, move away from government spending, and meet the needs of the ordinary American. Americans were excited for things to take an upward turn when the Watergate scandal emerged in 1972. The scandal indicated that the government had no problem lying or hiding things from the American people. This led people to wonder what else they had been lied to about, and uncertainty began to permeate the decade. In addition to all of this, the economy was tanking. Economic expansion came to a halt, and there was also an export trade deficit. Nixon took the U.S. off of the gold standard in hopes to make American goods cheaper overseas and reduce imports. Sadly, this did not work out. The U.S. was still competing against cheaper labor costs and more productive economies. To add to the list of bad things that occurred in the 70s, there were two oil shocks which implemented a tailspin of the economy, and subsequently unemployment rates were at the highest they had ever been. Overall, there was not much reason to be a happy camper in the 1970s. People looked for ways to escape their grief that emerged from these not so happy times. They did this through things like disco, drugs, sports, etc. They also looked to films. The film Grease is a great example of this. Grease was released in 1978, starring John Travolta as Danny Zuko and Olivia Newton-John as Sandy Olsen. While the movie was released in the 1970s, it does not demonstrate the morals, ideals, or moods of the decade. Instead, the movie is an idealized version of the 1950s. The creators of the film presumed that it would be more successful if it allowed people to get away from their worries. Grease is able to transport nostalgia of both adolescence and the 1950s when people felt times were less gloomy. Grease does this by sugarcoating every scene, making the era and youth pure, bright, and colorful. It exhibits many famous singing and dancing scenes, like Born to Handjive, Look at Me, I'm Sandra Dee, You're the One I Want, etc. These scenes present us with a very idealized image of what high school and teenagers are like. With pastel colors, dance moves, and old-fashioned costumes, these scenes especially represent a nostalgic look at adolescence. Again, these musical scenes are dreamy and upbeat, adding to the fantastical quality of the movie. In contrast, there were films like American Graffiti, which came out in 1973, that also depict the 1950s. Although this film is also capitalizing on nostalgia for the period, American Graffiti is filled with car wrecks, carelessness, death, and sadness, while Grease is filled with enduring friendships and long-lasting romance. Grease did not once acknowledge the American government or social ills taking place. Rather, it was used to distract the audience from reality and to emphasize themes and developments of romance and friendships between characters, especially with blissful scenes like the last one, where Danny and Sandy are happily reunited and lifted into the clouds. Since Grease was made toward the end of the 1970s, it represents a desire to return to simpler times. Even today, people love Grease. While we are not in as dreadful of a decade as the 1970s, people still love to live vicariously through the characters in this film. Personally, Grease left me feeling happy and nostalgic for the past. It is a great de-stressor for whatever your problems may be. Grease Live was produced this year, which was a live televised adaptation of the 1970s musical. In an effort to emulate the same energy as the original, virtually no changes were made to the production. Since Grease Live was able to grasp exceptional popularity, we can see that Grease's ability to excite people is still applicable today.